afternoon. Welcome back to the Shifley Lecture Series for our 2014-2015 series. As always, we're very grateful to the class of 1950, who with Vice Admiral Ralph and Mrs. Shifley have supported this museum. Pleased to have here today Dr. Bernard Cole, Professor of Maritime Strategy at the National War College in Washington, D.C. He previously served 30 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer, commanding USS Rathburn and Destroyer Squadron 35. He also served as Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer with the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam, 1967-1968. He is the author of 7 books, including The Great Wall at Sea, China's Navy in the 21st Century, and most recently, Asian Maritime Strategies, Navigating Troubled Waters, published in October 2013. And I've read both books. Fortunately, we have the same publisher, so they give me free books once in a while. No, I bought one of the books. So, sir, thank you very much for coming.
Okay, my
and,
pleasure. Thanks very much.
The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you. Is the microphone on? I think you can hear me anyway. I always start by, first, thanks very much. Honored to be here today. But I always start with this disclaimer on the bottom of the screen, since I'm a government employee. What I'm going to say today is my own thoughts, and I know for a fact not supported by some people in the intelligence community. But I also have started giving a second disclaimer, which is I'm not Chinese, okay? So anytime anybody stands up in front of you and says, this is what China is going to do, or this is what Beijing is thinking, you probably ought to get out the salt shaker, because I don't know if the people in Beijing know what they're going to be doing 10 or 20 years from now. And what I hope to do today is talk not just about the Navy, but try to give some sense about what I think the strategic thinking is in Beijing, some of their concerns. And let me start by saying that when Xi Jinping, the president of China, wakes up in the morning, the first thing he thinks about is not Taiwan, it's not the United States, it's probably how many incidents of social unrest have occurred in China in the last 24 hours. Okay, all politics is local. And his concerns overwhelmingly are domestic. It's not that he's not concerned about foreign affairs, but just like almost any national leader in the world, they have to worry about, if not getting reelected, at least maintaining political support. He's just as concerned about maintaining political support within the Chinese Communist Party as the President of the United States is in Congress or anywhere else. So just those two disclaimers. I'm not going to talk for a full hour. I'd much rather have questions and comments. In fact, I hope you interrupt me anytime you have a question. Don't let me just stand up here and chatter for an hour, please. Sometimes I've asked if China's goal is to dominate East Asia. Well, most of East Asia is China from a geographical position. Think of a country about the same size as the United States with 4 times the population, 1/3 the arable land, and not enough fresh water for people to drink. That's what I mean by domestic problems that the president of China has to resolve. Having said that, they've got the world's largest military, probably about 2.3 million folks in all the services. What's interesting is of those services, the Army dominates. Of those more than 2 million people, the Navy might be 230, 260,000, depending on estimates. Air Force a little bit bigger, about 300,000. Second Artillery, which controls their missile forces and nuclear weapons, about 90,000. So it's very much Army dominated. If you look at the command structure in the People's Liberation Army, which is the name for all the military services in China, again, with only 2 or 3 exceptions, every one of those 4-star positions has been filled by an Army officer. Okay? China borders 14 other nations, more than anybody else in the world. One of the accomplishments that Beijing has scored in the last couple of decades is they've resolved every one of their continental border disputes with everybody except India and Bhutan. Okay? Everybody else has agreed to a treaty. The maritime arena is a very different situation, and that's one of the reasons for the remarkable naval modernization we've seen since about 1995-96. And I'll note here that in 1995-96 was the latest and most serious Taiwan Strait crisis, when the U.S. sent 2 carrier battle groups to the vicinity of Taiwan to discourage the Chinese from taking military action. I really think that we may look back on 1996 the same way we look back on 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis brought home to Moscow that they needed a modern Navy. I think China may have taken that same lesson from 1996. We had to tell them we had sent the carrier battle groups there because their intel system, their surveillance system wasn't good enough for them to discover that by themselves. China has fisheries disputes with South Korea, North Korea, and Japan. They also in the East China Sea have a seabed energy deposit dispute with Japan, depending on where they define their continental shelf limit. They also dispute with Japan who owns some 5 rocks and 3 reefs that the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. Taiwan, of course, remains, I think, the biggest strategic issue for Beijing, not to allow Taiwan to become de jure independent. And of course, the South China Sea I'll talk about here in a bit, where several different countries claim some of the land features in that area. China historically has occasionally had a strong navy. Back in the Yuan dynasty, during the early Ming dynasty. But in both those two notable cases, China has raised and deployed a navy for a very specific purpose. In the case of the Yuan dynasty, to facilitate dynastic change. In the case of the Ming dynasty, where they sent Zheng He out on these 7 voyages to discover stuff and to seize territory for China. One of the bits of propaganda we often hear from China, I'm going to Shanghai next month for a conference, and I'm sure I'll hear this, is that China has never been aggressive and has never conquered territory. To which my standard response is, well, you know, if that's the case, how did the Qin dynasty, which is about this big, grow to the present size of China? Everybody just voluntarily joined Beijing? I don't think so. Throughout its history, military has been dominated by the army, except for those 2 instances I mentioned. And the reason's obvious. Historically, the threats to China's government, no matter where the China's government was or what the nature of it was, came from the interior of Asia, from the north or the west, not from the sea, with rare exception. In the mid-1980s, a general named Luo Haqing was appointed commander of the Navy. He later became the vice chairman of their Central Military Committee. He reverted back to wearing an Army uniform. His career was not one of being an operator. He was an acquisition and a technology development guy. Nonetheless, when he became head of the Navy in the mid-1980s, he set out to increase the Navy's profile within the People's Liberation Army and to gain a greater share of the budget resources for the Navy. And in that, he was very successful. He also laid out, I think probably for the first time, a viable maritime strategy for China. And it was based on a 3-phase plan. And once again, we pay a lot of attention to this plan, but I really do think that it was intended by Luo Haqing for internal purposes rather than foreign purposes. Nonetheless, he said that he put out these 2 island chains. These are really a U.S. construct from the Joint Chiefs of Staff about 1949, 1950. Okay? These were our goals after World War II. But he adopted them this way. The first island chain, he said, by the year 2000, the Chinese Navy should be able to exert sea control within the first island chain. And by 2020, the Chinese Navy should be able to exert sea control out to the second island chain, which is about 1,800, Guam's about 1,800 nautical miles from Shanghai. Pretty big area of ocean. And he said by 2050, that China should have aircraft carrier battle groups steaming around the world. Okay. Sometimes you read about a third island chain, by which the Chinese analysts will mean Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. Okay. By 2000, the Chinese Navy certainly was not able to exert sea control over these 3 seas, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and the South China Sea. I think by 2020, they will come pretty close to being able to do that. The sea control out to the second island chain is going to still be problematical. But I do think that the goal today in the Chinese military and in Beijing is that by 2050, China will, in fact, be able to exert sea control out to the second island chain at least. Now, I say 2050 because we can find lots of quotes by various senior Chinese civilian and military officials talking about 100 years from the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which of course was October 1949. So within 100 years, they want to achieve what they call a mature military force, which to me means out to the second island chain. Now, what do I mean by sea control? I don't mean Alfred Thayer Mahan, okay, or even Julian Corbett. I think what China wants to be able to do is to prevent events of which it does not approve from occurring, whether that's Taiwan declaring de jure independence, whether it's the United States being able to intervene in a Taiwan scenario if China decides to use military force, or whether it's preventing the United States intervene in a scenario over here on the Senkaku's Diaudais should armed force develop between China and Japan. Yes, sir.
Do you mean on the actual ocean or the entire maritime domain?
Thank you. That's a good point. China increasingly is writing about the entire maritime domain, on the surface, subsurface, in the air, space, cyber, and so forth. Now, I don't like to use cyber as a separate domain because I think cyber covers all the other domains. Whether you're on a submarine, surface ship, and an airplane, or worried about satellites, I think you have to be concerned about the cyber environment, if you will. So I think this is a maritime strategy. The dates may not have worked out, but I do think this is what China's building towards. Okay? Now, I didn't mention the Sea of Japan because China doesn't talk much about the Sea of Japan. That's outside their normal maritime strategic environment. In 2010, when we sent the George Washington Battle Group, George Washington, of course, is home port in Yokosuka, when we sent the GW into the Yellow Sea up here, China objected violently in public and also through government démarches. They believe that the three seas, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, are of vital national security concern to Beijing. Well, we probably feel the same way, say, about the Gulf of Mexico. The difference here, of course, is that we have mutual defense treaties or security treaties with South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and sort of a special relationship with Taiwan because of the Taiwan Relations Act, and with Singapore, and increasingly friendly relations with Vietnam and other nations in this area. So this is the area, it seems to me, that's of potential conflict between the United States and China, armed conflict, where we have defense treaties and the three seas, the Sanhai, that they consider to be of vital national security interest. So these are the areas that we try to focus on, I think. Now, if we look at the South China Sea, in 1922, a Republic of China commission drew an 11-dash line that included most of the South China Sea and Taiwan, and said all the land, all the land features within that 9-dash line, the cow's tongue or the U-shaped line, were in fact Chinese sovereign territory. That map has been republished since then and then several times by the Republic of China. And then in 1992, Beijing, the People's Republic of China, proclaimed a national law that included that as sovereign Chinese territory, the land features. The Chinese government has never claimed the entire water areas of the South China Sea as sovereign Chinese territory. What it says, the standard phrase, is the land features and associated waters. Well, that gets us into the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And without getting way into the grass here, let me just say that, excuse me, if you look at the reservations Beijing issued in 1994 when it signed the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention, and then you look at their claims for all these land features, you can see that the Chinese claim potentially includes the entire South China Sea. Not just the land features, but all the water areas there. Yes, sir?
Appreciate it if you could make a statement about the drive southward for resources. Since you mentioned they're short of resources, I think Japan kind of did the same thing in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to maintain a line, communication because of some of the resources down there.
Well, China's very much concerned about energy security, and by that they mean the affordability, the availability, and the security, military security of their energy supplies. They don't have a lot of domestic oil. They have considerable supplies up here in Manchuria. Right now they buy oil and they drill for oil around the world. The Chinese are concerned about something called the Malacca Dilemma. Now, I mentioned earlier that the PLA, the military, is still focused number one on Taiwan. But the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland for the last 10 years has really been very good, very positive. I personally think that there's very little chance of any military action, thank you, Claude, any military action occurring over the status of Taiwan between China and Taiwan. So if I'm a young Navy planner in Beijing, how am I going to continue justifying these budget increases? I need a problem. I need a strategic problem if it's not Taiwan. So something has arisen in the Chinese press in the last decade called the so-called Malacca dilemma. Because China, as well as the other nations in Northeast Asia, imports so much oil from Southwest Asia and Africa, and since the majority of it comes through the South China Sea, the so-called Malacca dilemma means that, well, if the U.S. can block this Strait of Malacca, that means that China would be starved for oil. Well, there's no validity to that. For one thing, as many of you know, the max draft of a tanker going through Malacca is 62 feet. And even then, you're probably scraping bottom. So they have to go through one of the other straits in the archipelago there before they head north. Number two, China only imports by sea at the most 10% of its daily energy requirements. Over 70% of its daily energy requirements comes from indigenous coal, which is a whole separate environmental problem. Of that 10% of imported seaborne oil, the majority of it goes to the private automobile sector. And as we saw in the lead up to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, if China wants to stop people from driving their cars, they just tell them to stop driving their cars. That's something beyond our ken here, obviously. Okay? But the important thing is not whether or not the Malacca dilemma is valid. The important thing is whether Beijing thinks it's valid, whether the so-called Malacca dilemma is going to affect their thinking. I don't know that it does, but I do know that China is very concerned about being able to import various resources, not just energy, but maybe even more so food. Wheat from the United States and China, soybeans from Brazil, other foodstuffs from Argentina. The most important import that China gets from Latin America is food. Okay? We read a lot about oil from Venezuela. That's not a player, really. The food they get from Brazil and Argentina is far more important than any oil they get from Venezuela. But certainly resources are a concern. Yes, sir.
So, now I might be jumping a slide or two ahead, but is what they're doing with the counter-piracy efforts, out in the CENTCOM-AOR, is that about lines of communication or just becoming a more professional Navy or participating in the international maritime domain?
Well, the Chinese Navy, the first task group got out there in December, or left China in December 2008 for the Gulf of Aden. I think they're on number 18 now. They send 3-ship task force out there, usually an oiler and 2 escorts. Sometimes they send 1 escort and an LPD and an oiler. Actually, it's a sign of how far the Navy has to come in that up until very recently, they only had 2 oilers they thought were capable of making that long deployment. So these guys are going port and starboard out in the Gulf of Aden, just swapping back and 6-month deployments back and forth. I think it's all of the above. They've developed a tremendous expertise, both in logistics and just operational maintenance and so forth on those long deployments, something they had never done before. What's ironic to me is if you took an American destroyer from Yoko going to the Gulf of Aden and a Chinese destroyer from Shanghai going to the Gulf of Aden, they do the same thing. They stop in Singapore to refuel, and they stop probably in Sri Lanka to refuel, and then they go to Oman and buy fuel there. And they fly supplies into Karachi or Oman or wherever else. Although Djibouti, all the navies do basically the same logistics, follow the same logistics pattern out there. Okay? But no doubt it's increased the professionalism a good deal. Other questions about this? Let me just note that the U.S. concern, the only position we take here or here is very significant. Our position with respect to the Senkakus or the Diaoyus is we don't have a position on who has sovereignty, despite the fact that in 1972 we gave the Senkakus back to Japan when we gave them back Okinawa. Okay? But because we gave them back to Japan, Japan has administrative control over the Senkakus, we say that they are covered under our defense treaty with Japan, Article 5. And everybody from the President on down, certainly the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, have personally told the President of China or their chief, or in General Dempsey's case, his counterpart in China, that those islands, those rocks, are covered by our defense treaty by Japan, and we will enforce the treaty. Now, this would be a terrible decision for any president to have to make. 5 rocks and 3 reefs. So do you sacrifice our relationship with China over this? or do you sacrifice our defense treaty with Japan over this? Hopefully it's a decision nobody's ever going to have to make. A little bit different in the South China Sea. Here again we say we don't care who's got, we're not going to take a position on who's got sovereignty over these rocks. We urge everybody to settle to resolve their differences peacefully, but don't screw around with freedom of navigation or we'll get involved immediately. And this is why it's of such concern what China's actual claim is. Because they've never said, as I mentioned earlier, whether they claim all the water areas or just these rocks and reefs and sandbars. Okay. The other claimants in the South China Sea, Vietnam claims everything. The Philippines claims some of the Spratlys over here. Malaysia also claims a good deal of them. Brunei claims one reef, and Indonesia has some islands that are technically outside the 9-dash line, but which China is obviously eyeing, perhaps enviously. We have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, as I mentioned. But whereas we say that our defense treaty with Japan covers these rocks up here, we have never stated that our treaty with the Philippines covers these rocks here. And the reason is our defense treaty with the Philippines was dated 1951. Manila never claimed those rocks until 1962. Okay? So we've waffled on that one. Okay. Any other questions about the South China Sea? One final thing. This is a very valuable body of water, not only because of the sea lines of communication, but also because of fisheries, which all the surrounding nations are doing their best to fish out. There's lots of oil and natural gas being recovered from the periphery. Nobody's ever discovered any oil and natural gas in any measurable quantities in the central South China Sea. Japan sent an expedition to look for it in 1936. So if anything's there, it's well hidden. Okay.
Sure, I'd just like to make one comment just to point out that Taiwan still has the exact same claim. They just don't import it.
Yes.
So
Taiwan,
a lot of people don't realize that.
Taiwan claims exactly the same thing as Beijing does. They claim it as Republic of China rather than People's Republic of China, of course. In fact, just in the last couple of weeks, there have been some press items showing up in Taipei. And in fact, there was a meeting to which the president of Taiwan appeared, in which they showed basically the same claims that mainland China has for these land features. So Taiwan's no help. Okay? In fact, right after Beijing passed the 1992 Territorial Law, the Taiwan legislature passed a similar resolution, not a law, claiming exactly the same thing. I'm going to show some ship pictures, not because we like to look at ship pictures, which we do. This is a Liaoning, ex-Soviet carrier the Soviets started building in 1982, and it sat there and rusted away in the Ukraine until 2002 when China dragged it to Shanghai. There's an amusing story. I once met the Norwegian owner of the tug company that towed this thing from the Black Sea around to China. And he said they lost the tow after they got through the straits into the Med. And he said they almost had to abandon it. You know, think of what that would have done. The Chinese had this thing in dry dock for 8 years. Obviously, ski ramp. It does have a resting gear. There was an article just this week in the Taiwan press saying here's what they're going to man it with. You know, a dozen or 24 J-15s, which is a Chinese ripoff of the Su-27 that they bought from Russia, and a bunch of helos doing different things. China just announced yesterday that they had 2 of the test pilots kill themselves in caracoling on this. As many of you know, this is not an easy thing to do, to caracol. And we shouldn't be surprised at that. In fact, the real question is how many other pilots have pringed in with that we don't know about, because the Chinese almost never report a failure in any sort of military exercise. You know. My big question is this thing was originally designed to have I'm going to get in the grass here a little bit, a pressure-fired steam engineering plant. Now, I'm talking history. I doubt there's anybody in this room, well, in uniform, certainly old enough to remember a peat-fired plant. It's one of those engineering things that looks great on paper, but when you get out to sea on a ship, it's a real bitch to maintain. Okay? So my question is, whether they had this thing in dry dock for 8 years, did they actually put a peat-fired plant in there or put in turbines or some other kind of steam plant? I don't know. And I've never seen any unclassed report that says what kind of engineering plant this thing has. But it's their first carrier. Right now, it's more a political statement than anything. I believe them when they say they're going to use this for training and development. That's a J-15. As you can see, it is a ripped-off Su-27. What's interesting is because this thing doesn't have catapults, for this aircraft to take off with a full load of gas, it can only carry 2 missiles, one on each wingtip. Okay. And we haven't observed them, well, they don't have any refuelers yet for the carrier, obviously. Discussions in the Chinese military press about getting an aircraft carrier go all the way back to the late 1970s. You know, they acquired the ex-HMAS Melbourne, I think in the 80s, and 3 or 4 different old Soviet carriers until they finally got this one, which they named Liaoning. Long history of guys in the Chinese Navy wanting aircraft carriers. The question is why, other than service pride. And we find many statements about every other member of the United Nations Security Council has got an aircraft carrier except China. That's not right because China is a world power. If you're worried about Taiwan, you don't really need an aircraft carrier. Hell, Taiwan's only 100 miles off the mainland. Although having a carrier theoretically would, you know, give you a 360-degree threat axis from Taiwan. The Indians are concerned, are convinced rather, that Chinese eventually is going to extend naval power into the Indian Ocean, which it might. I'm sure that, again, if I was that young Navy planner in Beijing, I'd be thinking about the Indian Ocean, certainly the sea lines of communication there, as a rationale for continuing to expand and modernize. Pretty strong hints that the Chinese are going to build 2 or 3 indigenous carriers, and I've even seen some talk about at least maybe the second indigenous carrier being nuclear powered, which would be logical. I don't think we should be surprised if that occurs. If they get that kind of carrier force, now we're talking about Luo Haqing's global Chinese Navy. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned earlier that the People's Liberation Army higher command, 3 stars in their rank structure, 4 stars in ours, have almost all been filled by Army officers, is I'm sure that the budget battles within the People's Liberation Army are very similar to what we see in Great Britain or France or the United States for that matter. Army, Navy, Air Force all arguing back and forth. In the Indian military, the Indian Navy has a terrible time trying to convince the Indian Air Force that they should be allowed to build aircraft carriers. I'm sure the Chinese Navy has to fight the same battles. This was the biggest victory that Luo Haqing scored, I think, is getting that additional profile for the Chinese Navy, helped inadvertently by our reaction to their threats against Taiwan in 1996. Okay, yes?
How do you see the carriers being utilized? And I ask that because so the French and American carriers go out, drop bombs, power projection, that kind of stuff. The Russian one, which this one they have now, is much more limited, more for fleet defense most likely. How do you see this playing in, and maybe not this one that they have if it's going to stay training and development, but the next ones?
Well, here's this article from the Taiwan press, which normally I wouldn't place a lot of stock in, except I know the author, and he's usually pretty well tied in. Let's see. "24 J-15s, okay, 6 ASW helos, 4 EW helos, and 2 smaller Angels, rescue helos. All these helos are ripped off from either the French or somebody else, the Russians, okay? So 12 helos and 24 of these things maybe for the supposed air group. So they're going to have a pretty much all-around capability theoretically. Now, one of the problems I have when I research and write about the Chinese Navy is, you read an article on Zhefeng Zhengbao or some other Chinese military publication, and it's written by some senior captain. Well, okay, who the hell is he? Senior captain somewhere between 06 and 07, not considered a flag officer. Is he just some instructor at the National Defense University? Or is he the Admiral Wu Shun Lee's EA? It makes a big difference, obviously. So ascertaining exactly what they intend to do with this is a little bit difficult. Once again, I'm sure if you're the captain of this thing, you want to be able to operate in all theaters, in all missions. But what the command authority in Beijing is going to have this thing do is a little bit unknown right now. Okay.
No E2 type of command and control airplane?
Not that we've seen. Now, this is an important point. Thank you for raising that. We know that the Chinese military system sort of owes its roots to the Soviets. And as those of us who were, Cold War veterans know, a very centralized control. It's not clear if the Chinese Navy or how far the Chinese Navy has gotten away from that model. In other words, how do you operate an effective submarine force if you don't give your COs maximum flexibility to operate? The best example I can give is provided by a former U.S. Air Attaché in Beijing, Ken Allen, who works in Washington. And as of just 6 months ago, Ken was saying that if you are in one of the Chinese AWACS equivalents, the designation of which escapes me right now, and you're controlling fighters, and you see a bogey, the controller on the Chinese AWACS does not have the authority to vector the fighter after the bogey. He has to go back to home field with a regimental commander or a vice commander in the Chinese Air Force, then goes separately to the fighter and directs the fighter after the bogey. Seems a little awkward, doesn't it? But that may be a problem that they face here. But we have not seen E2s at this. Lots of Chinese writing about our E2s and about the Taiwan E2s, obviously. Okay. This is the Jin-class ballistic missile submarine. There's 3 of them now stationed down at Hainan Island, and they built a new base at Sanya on the southern tip of the island. I haven't checked it recently, but it used to be, if you Googled Sanya, the first screen that came up said home of the Mrs. Universe contest. Okay. I've been in Hainan a couple times in the last couple years and haven't gotten close enough to see, they tend not to let visitors on their bases. I haven't gotten close enough to see anything but some ships coming in out of the harbor. It's kind of symbolic that this guy's missile hatches covers are raised, because the missile that's supposed to go on his boat, the JL-2, Sea Angel 2, which has been under development since at least the late 1990s, is still not operationally ready to go. Okay? Every year, DIA comes out and says, this year the JL-2 is going to be ready to go. And I guess if you keep saying that every year, eventually you'll be right.
Solid fuel or liquid fuel?
Solid fuel. The JL-2 is the seagoing variant of the DF-31, which is their first road-mobile solid fuel ICBM. Cannot reach the U.S. I mean, it can reach the western part of the U.S. It can reach Hawaii and Guam. Okay. Again, for at least the last 20 years, the DIA and CIA have been talking about the DF-41 or the DF-31 Bravo, or that will be extended, have enough range to reach the east coast of the U.S. And I'm sure eventually they'll get there. But they're having a very difficult time with their ICBM development program. Okay. There's 3 of these right now. U.S. estimates are probably build anywhere from 6 to 9. Yes?
Do you see an overlap here with their desire for sea control in certain areas, and then where they believe they've achieved sea control, and then having the patrol areas for the boomers?
You all remember that the Soviets eventually went to a bastion strategy for their boomers, keeping them in a White Sea or the Sea of a Husk, so they could surround them with SSNs, minefields, and so forth to defend against U.S. SSNs. That was largely the result of the Walker spy case. Anybody remember that? I'm happy to say that Walker died just about a month ago, hopefully very painfully. The submarine base is here. And my first thought was, they're going to follow the bastion strategy and use the South China Sea as a bastion, because there's some very deep parts of the South China Sea. But then if the DF-30, if the JL-2 can't reach the U.S. from here, what's the point? So maybe they're waiting for development of the follow-on missile. But they are going to be home ported down here. It'd be nice if they constrained themselves to that area for our ASW purposes. This is the Shang-class SSN. The one area, I like to say that the Chinese Navy has not been undergoing a crash modernization program in the last 20 years, except in submarine force. Just since 2001, they have built at least 35 submarines, put them out to sea. Most of them conventionally powered. In the 1960s, they built 5 Han-class nuclear-powered submarines, which was a copy of the old Soviet November class. Didn't work very well, extremely noisy, radioactively hot. There's now 2 or 3 of them still operating, depending on who you read. In 2005, they launched 2 of these Shang-class SSNs, and then they stopped building them. Probably ran into some engineering problems. This thing apparently is a copy of the old Soviet Victor class. I don't know, it's a Victor 1, Victor 3. They supposedly are now working on a follow-on class and have been for several years. I don't think we've seen any out at sea. We can see reports about, well, 3 of the follow-on class are Type 95s are in the water, but I don't think I've seen any open source pictures of them. I think that the reason they focus so much on submarines, especially conventionally powered submarines, is because of a Taiwan scenario. They believe that the way to slow or prevent U.S. intervention in a Taiwan scenario is to deploy a couple dozen conventionally powered submarines out there and make us look for them before we send the carriers in. It's a little bit short-sighted on their part, but I do think that's what they've been focusing on. The Indian Navy, of course, is convinced that the only reason they're building SSNs is to come after the Indians. Okay. But they are building a new class of nuclear-powered attack submarines. Very noisy. I was amazed. In August of 2007, the Defense Intelligence Agency published a magazine, a journal, in which the back page included a sound curve, self-noise curve, for submarines worldwide. And this thing was noisier than hell. Okay. Now, I don't understand why DIA published that, but and it may have been a mistake, but it's out there. But they'll have a long way to go in silencing. It would be interesting to know whether the reason they stopped building this thing was because it was too noisy or because they had engineering plant problems. Don't know.
Do your sailors have to, or do they get sterility pay like the Russian sailors get?
I don't know. I do know that when CNO went over there a few years ago, and I went in and pre-briefed him, and he said, "Oh, they're going to have me on one of the old Han-class nuclear boats." I said, "Make sure the plant's shut down." Okay. They do wear TLDs. Was that the thing we used to, TLDs? Yeah, rate monitors, yeah. Yes, sir.
Is that an anechoic coating on that?
Yes, they have anechoic coating. And you'd have to assume that they got a lot of the silencing stuff from the Russians. I mean, I'm assuming this thing was built with, out-of-works Russian engineers, as the Han certainly was. But obviously that's classified, I'm not going to get into that. Yes, sir.
I think in your book you laid out on the surface ship side, China constantly builds, 2 or 3 of each class, moves on to another one. Do you see that sort of pattern developing on the submarine side?
Absolutely. They did build 13 Song class. They built the first Song class and had a stepped sail on it. They built 2 like that and then stopped building them because they discovered that the ship was unstable. So they redesigned the sail, and then they built about 11 or 12 more. I think that's the largest submarine class they've got. They've bought 8 kilos from the Russians in addition. Okay. This is the Luang 2. And the reason I put this up here is you can see it apparently has an Aegis-like computer system, radar system on it. Don't know that for a fact. I have no idea what the computing power is behind that antenna array. This is the first class ship they've put out that is capable of area AAW. Okay, which of course is very important if you're going to send a task group anywhere. You want your ships to be able to defend somebody besides themselves. Okay, so this is the first one like that. This is probably going to be mass produced in Chinese terms. I think there's at least 6 of these in the water, and Jane says there's probably 4 to 6 more being built. So they may have finally decided on a standard ship. It's a combination gas turbine diesel. It's been to the Gulf of Aden more than once. Some of these ships have been to the Gulf of Aden more than once. I've been aboard about a dozen Chinese combatants over the last decade and a half. And of course, when I go aboard, they're a show ship. They've been painted to the nth degree, and you don't see any running rust coming out of the overboards or anything. But they do seem professionally maintained. I always ask to go down to the engineering spaces, and they're always clean, and again, I seem to be well maintained. I have no reason to doubt the professionalism of their sailors. Obviously, I've never been to sea on one or seen these guys operating.
Are those VLS cells on this one?
Yes, it's got VLS cells right here after this 100-millimeter gun. And it's got at least 2 of these 30-millimeter. They ripped this off from the Chinese love to say everything on their ships is indigenously designed. A friend of mine, retired Rear Admiral Eric McVaden, once counted on one of the previous ship classes, and he found 38 foreign systems that had been copied. And this is basically the Dutch-built 30-millimeter Sea Whiz, which is frankly probably a lot better than ours if they did it right. One of the biggest weaknesses I think that we can assume the Chinese Navy follows. Has to do with maintenance. In 2003, they found a Ming-class submarine floating half submerged. Crew all dead. Crew, the submarine commander, his staff, all dead. Apparently, when they came to the surface, they went to light off the diesel and shut down the electric motor. They didn't line up the vent system properly, or the vent system failed. So as soon as they lit off the diesel, they sucked all the air out of the boat. Okay? That caused the Chinese Navy to completely revamp their maintenance and supply system in the Chinese Navy. They fired everybody from the CNO on down, fired the shipyard commander. The boat had just come out of an overhaul. Installed for the first time in 2004 a centralized supply system for the Chinese Navy and a PMS type system, planned maintenance system, okay? First time. So hopefully they've gotten better. But I have to tell you that based on all my visits, but even more than that, all the talks I've had with former Chinese FAOs from the US Army and other China watchers, I can just see a Chinese sailor repacking a pump on a submarine and it says use lubricant type alpha. And he looks around and he doesn't have any lubricant type alpha, but he's got lubricant type Charlie. Well, I'll just use that instead. Well, now the pump's noisy, right? Noisier in design. So I really question their maintenance standards. Let me run through a couple more here. This is their new LPD. It looks remarkably like a San Antonio class, doesn't it? Supposedly capable of carrying 800 troops. Let me tell you, put 800 troops in this. It reminds me of my midshipman days on an APA when the racks were stacked 6 high. You know? This is a Type 22 trimaran, which is a missile boat, very stealthy, very low profile, but it can only go to sea for 24 hours. It can only operate in sea state 4. It's only got 1 set of crew on board. So how effective are those guys after, say, 12 hours of bouncing around? I love showing this, though, because in the late 90s, an Australian ferry company signed a joint agreement with an outfit in Guangzhou in southern China to build passenger ferries. Next thing we know, the same hull form is showing up as a missile boat in the Chinese Navy. Wonderful dual-use technology. This is perhaps the most valuable ship in the Chinese Navy. They did exactly what we did. They took an oiler and converted it to a tanker and converted it to a hospital ship, just as we did with Mercy and Comfort. This thing has toured the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden. It's been through the Caribbean. It's been through Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. In fact, I just saw an article in the defense press this morning saying that 2 Australian doctors, military doctors, are going to embark on this on its next cruise. It's a great goodwill factor and for spreading Chinese influence, if you will. As far as personnel are concerned, I think that the medical staff on this ship are permanently assigned as opposed to the way we operate Mercy and Comfort. The nurses on this ship, when they make a cruise, also put on theatricals and dance shows. Okay. The recruiting criteria, first of all, in China, the military is still a conscript military. Okay? It's only been in the last few years that you could serve for longer than 16 years as an enlisted person in the Chinese military. Now you can go for 30. We haven't reached the 30-year mark yet. Okay? The conscription system is male only. And so for a woman to enlist in the Chinese military to become an officer, and frankly, I've never seen a woman in uniform in the Chinese military who wasn't either serving T or maybe serving in one of the think tanks as a PhD, were the physical requirements that would have brought, it was the most sexist thing I've ever seen in the world. They described the body style. It was truly an incredible waste of resources when you consider the shortage of women in China. Compared to what the military could use. Okay, what is the U.S. concerned about? I think that they learned from the downfall of the Soviet Union in 89-90 not to try to match the U.S. dollar for dollar, ship for ship, plane for plane, but rather to focus their military modernization on very specific strategic instances, Taiwan being number 1. Now we've got the East China Sea and the South China Sea just behind that. Does the Chinese Navy pose a threat to U.S. interests? Not directly. Maybe when they get ICBMs that can reach, range the whole CONUS that will be. But it certainly poses a threat to allies. South Korea has a very strong economic relationship with China and is becoming friendlier and friendlier. Japan, on the other hand, is becoming less and less friendly, if you will. Threats to the U.S. indirectly. The Chinese military is considered by the folks in Beijing to be part of their comprehensive national power. Now, remember, this is a communist regime, and if we go back to the Marxist dialectic and so forth, the idea is that everything can be scientifically arranged and added and subtracted and calculated and so forth. So comprehensive national power, I first became aware of about 15 years ago when various civilian analysts in China were trying to measure the strength of the United States, the strength of China, the strength of other nations, by combining all the facets of national power, military, economic, political, social, you name it. So they come up with these comprehensive national power figures, and this is where their military is factored in. Okay. Let's see. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
Deng Xiaoping had cautious, slow motion philosophy, which seems to have changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
With the accelerated focus on oil and resources. So is that logical transition, or is this an accelerated transition that we need to worry about?
Well, after the end of the Cultural Revolution and the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China was a wreck. Deng Xiaoping, by 1978-79, finally emerged after 3 times being sent out to the countryside, finally emerged as the paramount leader and started a complete economic revolution in China. And I think what he basically said, what has developed, is he said to the people of China, you can become capitalists, do whatever you want, make as much money as you want, but stay out of politics. Leave the politics to the government. And I think the Chinese people have generally bought into that. I was on a study in New York many years ago, back in the mid-90s, when one of the participants was from the Chinese mission at the United Nations. And we were talking about this and Mao Zedong and all the damage he did, and Deng Xiaoping and the lack of freedom and individual liberty and so forth. And he said, wait a minute. He said, what you folks don't understand is that right now, the people of China are freer and better off than they have ever been before in all the thousands of years of Chinese history. So our prioritization of individual rights and liberty in this country is not going to be the prioritization we see in China. Now, what Deng Xiaoping did when he started this was, let's not be assertive. Let's concentrate on improving our domestic situation, improving the economy, improving the living conditions of the Chinese people, and eventually our strength will come to the fore. Then also during Jiang Zemin's term as president between 92 and 2000, the Chinese president serves 2 consecutive 5-year terms. 2002, China watchers began to detect sort of a liberalization process politically. Some of the village and county level elections looked like to be semi-democratic. So when Hu Jintao became president in 2002, most China observers said, oh, well, we're going to see this liberalization continue. Wrong. Hu Jintao went the other way, started clamping down. Same sort of thing when Xi Jinping took over a couple years ago. Everybody said, well, he spent this time in Iowa studying agriculture and he's going to be a liberalizer and so. Absolutely, he is clamping down on what they call dissident activities in China. And publicly, China is becoming much more assertive militarily in international affairs. Part of the reason for that is the Chinese view that because of the 2008 economic crisis in this country, the U.S. is in decline. Now, we occasionally see things in the Chinese press saying that's not true, but overall, I think that's still the popular opinion in China. The U.S. is in decline, China is rising, it's China's turn. The U.S. is trying to contain China and prevent it from attaining its rightful place in the world. And that worries me. That's dangerous. Yes, sir.
The recent shenanigans with the airplanes intercepting our airplanes and stuff, do you think that's a result of China now seeing Obama as weak and therefore won't, or do you think that's just a bunch of cowboys that are
I think,
too much leash?
Yeah, Dennis Blair is an old shipmate of mine. He was PACOM when the EP3 incident happened in 2001, and Dennis was there had been a whole series of these poor airmanship demonstrations, finally resulting in this crash. Now the Chinese pilot had the wonderful name of Wang Wei. was the squadron commander. Now, a squadron in the Chinese Air Force is only 4 airplanes. They call, what we would call a squadron command, they call a regiment. But he was a squadron commander, which meant in Chinese terms he should have been the best pilot in the squadron. He may have been, except on that day. So Dennis was convinced that that was just a local cowboy. I've been reading lots of stuff, and I heard the CNO speak at the Carnegie Endowment on Monday. I think we're pretty well convinced that this latest incident with the P-8 was a couple of local guys acting like 26-year-old fighter pilots. You know, they should have known better. And, you know, I spent just enough time in aviation. Doing a barrel roll over another airplane is not something you should do on a regular basis. You know, if you sneeze at the wrong time or have a bad day or something. I think it's a local problem. However, the national position in Beijing is we shouldn't be doing these flights. The P-8 and the P-3 with it they were 100 miles off the coast, within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone claimed by China, but you know, not flying over the beach or anything. So hopefully, I think the Navy's effort, what Admiral Greenert said on Monday, was trying to get the word to the senior folks in Beijing. You got these cowboys down there, get a hold of them, as they did apparently after 2001. Get them back in the box before something stupid happens. Because as you guys know better than I, okay, the P-3 had 4 turboprop engines. If you whack a P-8, the sucker's probably going to go in the water. Okay, so.
Sir, that's the last question, unfortunately, because we've got
Oh,
to let our
okay.
midshipmen go and the next class is coming in. So
Oh,
thank
okay.
you very much.
Thank you guys. Thank you very much.